The Pacific Ocean, 1942. In the dark, crushing depths, an American submarine commander lines up the shot of a lifetime. Through his periscope, the silhouette of a Japanese merchant ship, a Maru, fills the crosshairs. It's a perfect setup. He gives the command. Fire 1, fire 2. Two streaks of white foam race towards the target. The crew counts the seconds, their knuckles white, sweat dripping in the humid, recycled air of their steel tube. This is it, a hit that will send thousands of tons of vital supplies to the bottom of the sea. The seconds stretch into an eternity. Then, nothing. A dull thud, perhaps, or worse, the torpedoes are seen porpoising out of the water or simply vanishing. On the enemy ship, lookouts might point, maybe even laugh. The submarine has given away its position for nothing. It must now crash dive and endure a terrifying counterattack of depth charges, all while knowing their primary weapon, the one thing that justifies their existence, is a dud. This was the infuriating, soul-crushing reality for the U.S. Submarine Force in the opening year of the Pacific War. They were sent into the heart of enemy territory, thousands of miles from home, armed with the most expensive and technologically advanced torpedo in the world. And it was shamefully, catastrophically broken. They started the war as hunters who couldn't kill. But by 1945, this same force would be known by another name, the Silent Killers. They would single-handedly cripple the Japanese Empire, sinking over 1,300 merchant ships and more than 200 warships. They would starve Japan's factories, ground its planes, and leave its armies stranded. This is the story of how they went from firing duds to putting an entire nation on its knees. December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a devastating blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The battleships, the pride of the Navy, were burning wrecks. But in the chaos, one asset remained largely untouched, the Submarine Force. These were the Gato-class submarines, brand new, state-of-the-art predators. Over 300 feet long, they could travel 11,000 miles, stay submerged for 2 days, and dive to a depth of 300 feet. They were equipped with radar, advanced sonar, and 10 torpedo tubes. On paper, they were the perfect weapon to strike back at Japan, to wage a guerrilla war beneath the waves, deep inside enemy-controlled waters. And their weapon was the Mark 14 torpedo. Developed in secret over 2 decades at a cost of $100 million, an astronomical sum at the time, the Mark 14 was a technological marvel. He was a steam-powered torpedo that was faster, had a longer range, and carried a larger warhead than any of its predecessors. But its most celebrated feature was a top-secret exploder, the Mark 6. This magnetic influence detonator was designed to be a game-changer. Instead of needing to physically strike the side of a ship, the Mark 6 would sense the magnetic field of a vessel's steel hull and detonate directly beneath the keel. An explosion here would break the ship's back, sinking it with a single devastating blow. It was a brilliant idea, a war-winning idea. The problem? It had never been properly tested. The Great Depression meant budgets were tight. A single Mark 14 torpedo cost $10,000. Firing one to a real target ship for a live-fire test was deemed too expensive. Instead, the Bureau of Ordnance, or BuOrd, ran tests with dummy warheads and declared the weapon a resounding success. So when war broke out, American submariners went to sea with complete faith in their wonder weapon. That faith would soon be shattered.
The reports started trickling in almost immediately. Captains reported perfect shots where torpedoes simply passed harmlessly beneath the target. They swore they had calculated the range, speed, and angle perfectly. In Washington, the admirals at BuOrd were dismissive. The torpedo was perfect, they insisted. The fault must lie with the commanders. They weren't aiming correctly. They were firing from too far away. They were making excuses for their own incompetence. But the men on the front lines knew better. On December 24, 1941, the submarine USS Seawolf, captained by Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder, fired 4 torpedoes at a Japanese freighter. He watched in disbelief as all 4 ran directly under the ship without exploding. He was so certain of the malfunction that he surfaced to engage the ship with his deck gun, a suicidal move for a submarine. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was happening across the entire Pacific Fleet. Submariners were risking their lives, penetrating heavily defended harbors, enduring bone-rattling depth charge attacks, only for their torpedoes to fail them at the critical moment. Morale plummeted. They called their boats steel coffins and their multi-million-dollar torpedoes duds. The Mach 14 torpedo, it turned out, wasn't suffering from one problem. It was suffering from a cascade of 3 catastrophic hidden flaws. The first problem was depth. The torpedoes were running, on average, 10 feet deeper than they were set. The pressure sensor that controlled the depth was calibrated for peacetime conditions, not the rigors of a combat patrol. So, when a captain set his torpedo to run at 15 feet to hit a ship's hull, it was actually streaking through the water at 25 feet, passing harmlessly under the keel. The BuOrd's response? They blamed the crews for miscalculating the draft of enemy ships. The second problem was the miracle Mark 6 magnetic exploder. While it worked in theory, it was far too sensitive. The Earth's magnetic field varies across the globe. A torpedo tested in the North Atlantic would behave differently in the South Pacific. Many torpedoes were detonating prematurely, exploding in a massive cloud of water hundreds of feet short of their target, alerting the enemy and achieving nothing. Others were complete duds, failing to detonate at all, even as they passed directly under the enemy. The silent service was becoming the loud and useless service. But the most insidious problem was the one nobody suspected. Even if the torpedo ran at the correct depth, and even if the faulty magnetic exploder was turned off, the contact exploder, the simple firing pin designed to detonate on impact, was also broken. If a Mark 14 hit a ship's hull at a perfect 90-degree angle, the force of the impact was so great that the firing pin mechanism would buckle and jam before it could strike the detonator. The torpedo would just clang against the side of the ship, a dud, and sink. The only time it worked was on an angled, glancing blow, which was a much harder shot to make. For nearly 2 years, the U.S. Submarine Force was fighting with one hand, and sometimes both hands, tied behind its back. They were in the right places. They were brave and skillful, but their weapons were betraying them. The rage and frustration in the fleet were boiling over. Something had to change.
The hero of this story isn't a frontline commander, but a rear echelon admiral. In early 1943, Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood took command of the Pacific Submarine Fleet. He was a submariner's submariner. He trusted his men, and when they told him the torpedoes were garbage, he believed them. He was tired of the bureaucratic excuses coming from Washington. He decided to defy the Bureau of Ordnance and find the truth for himself. First, the depth problem. On June 21, 1943, in the quiet waters off Western Australia, Lockwood ordered a test that BuOrd had deemed unnecessary. He had his men string a large fishnet between 2 posts. Then he had the submarine USS Muskellunge fire a series of torpedoes, without warheads,
set for a depth of 10 feet. The results were shocking. The first torpedo ripped through the net not at 10 feet, but at 25 feet. The second at 18 feet. Not a single torpedo ran true. The skippers had been right all along. Lockwood immediately ordered all torpedoes in his command to be recalibrated. Problem 1 was finally on its way to being solved. Next, the magnetic exploder. Frustrated by the constant premature detonations, Lockwood issued a direct and controversial order on July 24, 1943. Deactivate the Mark VI exploder on all torpedoes. He was telling his men to turn off the wonder weapon's most vaunted feature. BuOrd was furious, but Lockwood didn't care. He chose a weapon that worked some of the time over one that failed most of the time. But that only revealed the final, hidden flaw. With the depth fixed and the magnetic exploder off, commanders were now getting solid direct hits on enemy ships, but the torpedoes still weren't exploding. They were hearing the heartbreaking clank of a dud hitting the hull. This was the last straw. Lockwood knew he had to prove the contact exploder was faulty, so he devised another ingenious, if crude, test. He couldn't afford to waste torpedoes by firing them at a cliff face. Instead, he ordered his men to hoist dummy torpedoes, real torpedoes filled with sand instead of explosives, up a 90-foot crane and drop them, nose first, onto a steel plate. Drop after drop, the results were the same. On direct 90-degree impacts, the firing pin mechanism inside the warhead was crushed and failed. On angled impacts, it worked perfectly. The evidence was undeniable. The skippers had been right about everything. Armed with this irrefutable proof, Lockwood forced the Bureau of Ordnance to finally admit the truth. They redesigned the firing pin, using a stronger alloy and a more robust mechanism. By late 1943, almost 2 full years into the war, the U.S. Submarine Force finally had a reliable weapon. The Mark XIV torpedo, once a source of shame and frustration, was now fixed, and the hunters of the deep were about to be unleashed. The change was immediate and dramatic. With torpedoes that ran true and exploded on contact, American submarines began to systematically dismantle the Japanese Empire. The strategy was brutal and simple: wage unrestricted warfare against Japan's merchant marine. Japan was an island nation. It had no oil, no rubber, no iron ore. Every single bullet, every plane, every tank, and every bowl of rice for its soldiers and citizens depended on a constant flow of resources from its conquered territories in Southeast Asia. The merchant ships, the Marus, were Japan's bloodline. The submarines were tasked with cutting that artery. The submariners called this the Great Turkey Shoot. They prowled the vital shipping lanes of the Luzon Strait and the South China Sea. They operated alone, or later in coordinated groups called wolf packs, for months at a time in the heart of enemy territory. Life aboard was a mix of mind-numbing boredom and sheer terror. Days were spent submerged in the sweltering heat, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Then the call. Periscope depth. A lookout would spot smoke on the horizon. The hunt was on. The captain would maneuver his boat into position, a deadly game of aquatic chess, calculating the target's speed and course. Then came the order to fire, and this time the torpedoes worked. The results were devastating. The USS Wahoo, under the command of the legendary Dudley Mush Morton, sank an entire 4-ship convoy in a single audacious surface attack at night. The USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, claimed to have sunk 10 ships in one patrol, becoming one of the most successful submarines of the war. They weren't just sinking freighters, they were taking down warships. The USS Archerfish sank the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, on its maiden voyage. The USS Kavala sank the Shikaku, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, nothing was safe. For the Japanese, it was a catastrophe they could not stop. Their anti-submarine warfare tactics were primitive compared to the Allies in the Atlantic. They had underestimated the threat, and now they were paying the price. By 1944, the submarine blockade was strangling Japan. Oil imports fell by 80%. The mighty Japanese fleet was often confined to port for lack of fuel. Pilot training was cut back because there wasn't enough aviation gas. Factories producing tanks and planes slowed to a crawl due to a lack of steel and rubber. Food was rationed. The civilian population began to starve. The numbers tell the story. The U.S. Submarine Force, which comprised less than 2% of the entire U.S. Navy, accounted for 55% of all Japanese maritime losses. They sank 5.3 million tons of merchant shipping. They destroyed an empire's ability to wage war, ship by ship, torpedo by torpedo.
But this staggering success came at a terrible cost. Submarine duty was the most dangerous job in the American military. Once a submarine was damaged and forced to the surface, it was a sitting duck. When it was lost with all hands. There were no survivors from a submarine that went down in the deep. The ocean was their final, unmarked grave. Men lived under the constant threat of the depth charge, an explosion that could crack the hull, shatter light bulbs, and send men flying. They endured hours of this psychological torture, silent and rigged for deep running, hoping the enemy destroyers above would give up the hunt before their air or their nerve ran out. The USS Tang, after its legendary patrol, was sunk by its own malfunctioning torpedo, a final tragic irony. Richard O'Kane and a handful of others on the bridge survived, only to be picked up by the Japanese and endure brutal captivity. The USS Wahoo, Mush Morton's boat, was lost with all hands in the Sea of Japan. In total, 52 U.S. submarines were lost during the war. Over 3,500 submariners made the ultimate sacrifice. The U.S. Submarine Force had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American Armed Forces in World War II. They were heroes who operated in secret, whose victories were often not known until long after the fact, and whose deaths were marked only by a boat failing to return to port. When the war ended in August 1945, Japan was a nation brought to its knees. While the B-29 bombers and the atomic bombs are often credited with the final victory, many historians argue that the war had already been won in the crushing darkness of the Pacific depths. The submarine campaign had effectively severed Japan from its empire, leaving it an isolated, starving island with a silent, motionless war machine. The story of the U.S. Submarine Force in the Pacific is a dramatic tale of redemption. It's a story of a catastrophic technological failure, of bureaucratic arrogance, and of the determination of men on the front lines who refuse to be ignored. It's a testament to how fixing one critical component, the torpedo, transformed an entire branch of the military from a frustrated and ineffective force into the single most decisive weapon in the Pacific theater. They were the silent service. They operated alone, hunted ruthlessly, and died quietly. They started the war with shamefully broken weapons, and they ended it by choking an empire into submission. They were the ghosts beneath the waves, the silent killers of the Pacific.